Jake Morrison had memorized every detail from the photograph. Soft brown curls, delicate hands folded in her lap, eyes that looked away from the camera with shy uncertainty. He stood beside his wagon at the trading post, watching the dust cloud grow larger on the horizon, knowing that in minutes he would meet Sarah Beth Collins, the woman who would become his wife. But when the travel wagon lurched to a stop and the door swung open, Jake's world didn't just tilt sideways, it exploded into a nightmare that would either save his life or get him killed before sunset. The woman who stepped down was nothing like the photograph. Her hair was darker, pulled back severely, her hands were calloused and shaking, and when she looked at him there was no shyness in her green eyes, only terror so raw it made his chest tighten with dread. "You must be Jake Morrison," she said, her voice carrying an edge that cut through the afternoon heat like a knife through silk. She didn't wait for his response, didn't extend her hand, didn't smile. I'm Sarah Beth." But Jake had spent 10 years as a Territorial Marshal before settling into ranch life, and every instinct he'd developed in that decade was screaming that something was desperately wrong. This woman's voice was different from the one he'd imagined reading her letters. Her posture spoke of someone expecting violence at any moment, and when she glanced back at the wagon driver, Jake caught a flash of something that made his blood run cold. Fear, not nervousness about meeting a new husband. Pure, animal terror. "Ma'am," Jake said carefully, his hand instinctively moving closer to his gun belt. "You seem upset. Was there trouble on the road?" The woman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There's been a change of plans," she said, reaching into the wagon and pulling out a blood-stained leather satchel with trembling hands. Sarah Beth couldn't make the journey. Behind her, the wagon driver was already unhitching his team with suspicious haste, avoiding eye contact with both of them. Whatever had happened during that journey, the man clearly wanted no part of discussing it. "The letters," Jake said slowly, pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to form in his mind. "You've been writing to me for 6 months about wedding arrangements, about a lot of things that have changed." The woman stepped closer, and Jake caught a scent that was nothing like the rosewater Sarah Beth had mentioned in her letters. This was something earthier, more desperate, the smell of someone who had been running for her life. "Some things you need to know," she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Some things that were never mine to tell you in the first place." "But Sarah Beth," she stopped, swallowing hard. "Sarah Beth can't tell you anything anymore." The way she said it made Jake's stomach clench with dread. This wasn't about a delayed journey or changed wedding plans. This woman was carrying news that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his carefully arranged future. "Ma'am," Jake said, his martial instincts taking over, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened to Sarah Beth Collins." The woman looked into his eyes, and Jake saw something there that made him reach for his gun without conscious thought. Not because she was dangerous, but because of what she was about to tell him. "Sarah Beth is dead," she whispered, "murdered 3 days ago, and the men who killed her are coming for me now." Before Jake could respond, before he could even process what she'd said, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed across the trading post. The bullet hit the wagon wheel behind them, sending splinters flying. "Get!" Jake shouted, grabbing the woman and pulling her behind the wagon as more shots rang out. Through the dust and chaos, he could see 3 riders approaching at full gallop, their weapons already smoking. As they crouched together behind the meager cover, the woman pressed something into Jake's hand, a small piece of paper, creased and stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. "My name isn't Sarah Beth," she gasped between gunshots. "It's Emma Collins. Sarah Beth was my twin sister, and those men killed her because they thought she was me." Jake stared at her in shock as bullets whistled over their heads. "Why would anyone want to kill you?" Emma's green eyes were bright with unshed tears and desperate determination. "Because I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. Because I have evidence that could destroy some very powerful people. And because," she looked directly at him, "the man who ordered my sister's murder is someone you know, someone you trust." The shooting stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, Jake could hear the riders calling out to each other, professional voices, coordinated movements. These weren't random outlaws or opportunistic bandits. "Jake Morrison," one of them shouted, "send out the woman and no one else gets hurt." Jake's blood turned to ice. They knew his name. They had come here specifically looking for Emma, knowing exactly where to find her. "Emma," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "Who did you see? What evidence are you carrying?" But before she could answer, Jake recognized the lead rider's voice calling his name again. "Sheriff Tom Bradley." his friend for the past 5 years, the man who had helped him establish his ranch, who knew about his mail-order bride arrangement, who had access to territorial records and federal communications, the man who had betrayed him to killers. Emma, Jake said, his voice deadly calm, when I give the signal, we're going to run for the trading post. Whatever evidence you're carrying, whatever you witnessed, it's about to become the most important thing in either of our lives. As the riders drew closer, Jake realized he wasn't just protecting a stranger anymore. He was harboring a federal witness whose testimony could bring down corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, and Sheriff Bradley was willing to kill them both, to keep that testimony buried. The trading post offered better cover, but Jake knew they were still trapped. Through the window, he could see Sheriff Bradley deploying his men around the building with military precision. These weren't local lawmen pursuing a criminal. This was an execution squad. Emma, Jake said, checking his ammunition, I need you to tell me everything. Right now. Who did you see? What kind of evidence are we talking about? Emma pulled the blood-stained satchel closer to her chest. 3 weeks ago, I was working as a seamstress in Millfield. I had a late appointment at Judge Harrison's house. Alterations for his wife's dress. When I arrived, the house seemed empty, but I heard voices from his study. She paused, glancing nervously at the window where shadows moved outside. I hid in the hallway and listened. Judge Harrison was meeting with 2 other men. They were discussing land grants, specifically how to falsify survey reports to make worthless property appear valuable for railroad investments. Jake felt his stomach drop. Land fraud involving federal judges could destroy territorial statehood plans and cost investors millions of dollars. But that's not the worst part, Emma continued. One of the men was talking about eliminating witnesses, people who had discovered their scheme. He had a list. Names of surveyors, clerks, anyone who might have seen the false reports. And your name was on that list. My sister's name was on it. Emma's voice broke. Sarah Beth worked as a clerk in the Territorial Land Office. She must have seen something, copied something. The man said she had to be eliminated before she could testify to federal investigators. Outside, Sheriff Bradley's voice cut through the afternoon air. Morrison, you've got 5 minutes to send out the woman or we come in shooting. Jake moved to another window, studying the positioning of Bradley's men. Emma, who was the third man in that meeting, the one with the list. Emma's face went pale. That's what I was afraid you'd ask. It was Deputy Marshal Frank Coleman, your former partner. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Frank Coleman had been his closest friend during his marshal years. The man had been best man at Jake's first wedding, had helped him through his wife's death, had recommended this territory when Jake decided to start over as a rancher. Frank's been feeding information to Judge Harrison for years, Emma continued. Names of federal investigators, timing of raids, locations of witnesses. In exchange, he gets a cut of the land fraud profits. Jake's mind raced through the implication. If Frank was involved, then Jake's own cover as a retired marshal was blown. They knew exactly who he was, what his capabilities were, and how dangerous he could be if he decided to help Emma. There's more, Emma said, opening the satchel with trembling hands. Before they killed Sarah Beth, she managed to hide copies of the falsified land grants. She left them for me with a note explaining everything. Names, dates, amounts of money involved. She pulled out a stack of official-looking documents, and Jake could see immediately that they represented evidence of systematic fraud worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Emma, why didn't you take this to federal authorities in the territorial capital? Because I don't know who to trust, she replied. If Deputy Marshal Coleman is involved, how many other federal officials are taking bribes? How do I know who's honest and who's part of the conspiracy? A new voice called from outside, and Jake's blood turned to ice. Frank Coleman himself had arrived. Jake, Frank's familiar voice carried easily through the trading post walls. I know you're in there, partner, and I know you're probably confused about what's happening. Let's talk this through like reasonable men. Jake moved to the front window, staying hidden behind the wall. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see Frank Coleman sitting confidently on his horse, flanked by Sheriff Bradley and 2 other armed men. Frank, Jake called back. Funny thing about reasonable men, they don't usually travel with execution squads. Frank's laugh was the same easy chuckle Jake remembered from their marshal days. Jake, you always were too suspicious for your own good. The woman in there with you is a dangerous criminal. She murdered her own sister and stole federal documents. We're here to bring her in for trial. Is that so? Jake replied. Then why are you working with land fraudsters and corrupt judges? The silence that followed was deafening. When Frank spoke again, His voice had lost all pretense of friendship. I was hoping we could do this the easy way, Jake, for old time's sake, but if you want to play Marshal again, I'm prepared for that too. Emma moved closer to Jake, her voice urgent. There's something else you need to know. In Sarah Beth's note, she mentioned that they've been planning this for months. The mail-order bride arrangement, bringing me here to your ranch, it was all part of their plan. Jake stared at her in shock. What do you mean? They knew Sarah Beth had copied the documents. They knew she would try to get them to safety. Frank Coleman suggested she send them to you, told her you were an honest ex-marshal who could be trusted. He arranged the mail-order bride correspondence as a way to get her here, where they could eliminate both of you quietly. The full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Jake hadn't just been set up to marry a stranger. He'd been lured into a trap designed to eliminate a federal witness and anyone who might help her. But Sarah Beth figured it out. Emma continued. That's why she sent me instead. She thought if she stayed hidden and I came here with the evidence, we might have a chance to expose the truth. Instead, they killed her and followed you here. And now they're planning to kill us both and claim we died in a shootout with dangerous criminals. Before Jake could respond, the sound of breaking glass announced that Frank's patience had run out. Smoke began pouring through the shattered windows as the men outside lit fire arrows and shot them into the trading post. Time to go, Jake said, grabbing Emma's hand and pulling her toward the back of the building. There's a root cellar behind the store. We can get out through there. As they ran through the smoke-filled building, Emma clutched the evidence against her chest. Jake, even if we escape, where can we go? They'll follow us anywhere in the territory. Not anywhere, Jake replied, kicking open the cellar door. I know a place where we can get federal protection, but it's going to be a hard ride, and Frank's going to do everything he can to stop us. They descended into the darkness of the root cellar as flames began to consume the trading post above them. The tunnel led to an old mine shaft that emerged a quarter-mile away, hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees. As they crawled through the narrow passage, Emma spoke quietly. Jake, why are you helping me? You don't know me. For all you know, everything I've told you could be lie. Jake paused in the darkness, considering her question. Because 10 years as a federal marshal taught me to recognize truth when I hear it. And because he turned to look at her in the dim light filtering through cracks in the tunnel ceiling. Someone murdered your sister to keep her quiet. That's not something I can let stand. They emerged from the tunnel to find Jake's horse still tied where he'd left it that morning, along with Emma's traveling bag that had somehow survived the attack on the trading post. Can you ride? Jake asked, checking the horizon for signs of pursuit. I grew up on a ranch, Emma replied, swinging up behind him on the horse. The question is, where are we going? Fort Collins, Jake said, spurring the horse into motion. There's a federal judge there, Judge Michael Warren. He's completely clean. Been investigating territorial corruption for months. If we can reach him with your evidence, he can issue federal warrants and provide protection. How far? 50 miles. Through some of the roughest country in the territory. Behind them, smoke rose from the burning trading post, and Jake could already see riders emerging from the flames. Frank Coleman and his men had discovered their escape route, and were preparing to give chase. Emma, Jake said as they rode hard across the open prairie. There's something I need you to understand. Frank Coleman knows me better than almost anyone. He knows how I think, how I fight, where I'm likely to run. Getting to Fort Collins is going to require us to stay ahead of someone who can predict my every move. Emma's arms tightened around his waist as their horse leaped a narrow creek. Then we'll have to think like someone else. Someone he doesn't know. Jake smiled grimly. You got any idea? As a matter of fact, I do. Sarah Beth and I used to play a game when we were children, sneaking around our father's ranch without being caught. We called it ghost walking. The trick wasn't to avoid the places someone might look for you. It was to hide in the places they'd already searched. The sound of pursuing horses was getting closer, and Jake could see Frank's tracking skills were as sharp as ever. They were following the most direct road to Fort Collins, which meant Frank could cut them off at several points along the way. What are you thinking? Jake asked. Instead of running straight to Fort Collins, we double back, hide somewhere Frank has already been, somewhere he wouldn't think to look again. Jake considered the idea as they crested a hill and saw the dust cloud of their pursuers clearly visible behind them. It was risky, but Emma was right about Frank's tracking methods. He would anticipate every conventional escape route. "There's an abandoned cabin about 10 miles back the way we came," Jake said. "Used to be a way station for the old stage line. Frank passed right by it this morning when he was positioning his men around the trading post." "Perfect. He'll assume we're running away from that area, not toward it." They changed direction, using a rocky creek bed to mask their horses' hoofprint. The maneuver would buy them time, but Jake knew Frank would eventually figure out what they'd done. As they rode, Emma shared more details about the conspiracy she'd uncovered. The land fraud scheme was massive, involving dozens of officials and affecting thousands of acres of territorial land. Investors back east were paying premium prices for worthless property, based on falsified geological surveys. "The money involved is staggering," Emma explained. "Enough to buy judges, marshals, even territorial governors. Frank Coleman is just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and your sister stumbled into the middle of it." Sarah Beth was always too curious for her own good. When she noticed discrepancies in the land office records, she started making copies, trying to figure out what was going on. They reached the abandoned cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Jake uncomfortably of the flames they'd escaped earlier. The building was small but solid, with thick log walls that would provide good cover if Frank's men found them. Inside they found evidence that other travelers had used the cabin recently. Blankets, canned food, and most importantly, a cache of weapons left by someone who understood the dangers of territorial travel. "Emma," Jake said, checking the rifles they'd found, "I need to ask you something. When this is over, when we've delivered your evidence to Judge Warren and Frank's conspiracy is exposed, what then?" Emma looked up from where she was examining her sister's documents by lamplight. "What do you mean?" "I mean you came here expecting to become Sarah Beth, to start a new life as my wife. Obviously that's not going to happen. But I need to know, are you planning to stay in the territory or will you go back east where it's safer?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the flickering light. "Jake, are you asking because you're worried about my safety, or because you're hoping I'll stay?" The question caught him off guard. In the space of a single day, his entire world had been turned upside down. His friend had betrayed him, his bride was dead, and he was harboring a federal witness, whose testimony could change territorial politics forever. But looking at Emma now, seeing the courage she'd shown and the determination in her green eyes, Jake realized something surprising. "I'm hoping you'll stay," he said quietly. Emma moved closer to him, and in the lamplight, he could see tears glistening in her eyes. "Jake, I need you to understand something. When this is over, when Frank and his associates are in prison, I'm still going to be the woman whose sister died because of what I witnessed. I'm going to carry that guilt for the rest of my life. And I'm going to be the man who helped you get justice for her," Jake replied. "Seems like we'd make a good team." Before Emma could respond, the sound of horses approaching made them both freeze. Through the cabin's single window they could see torches moving in the darkness. Frank Coleman had found them. "Jake," Frank's voice carried across the clearing, "I know you're in there. Let's end this before anyone else gets hurt." Jake moved to the window, staying hidden behind the wall. He could see at least 6 men surrounding the cabin, all heavily armed and positioned for a siege. "Frank," Jake called back, "we both know how this ends. You're not taking Emma alive, and you're not letting me walk away with what I know. You always were smart, partner, but you're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and I'll make it quick." Emma joined Jake at the window, the evidence clutched in her hands. "How many men does he have?" "Too many. But this cabin has something Frank doesn't know about." Jake moved to the back wall and pushed aside a loose board, revealing a hidden passage. "This used to be a station on the Underground Railroad. There's a tunnel that leads to a cave system about half a mile away." "Will Frank know about it?" "Not unless he's done a lot more research on this place than I think." They gathered the weapons and Emma's evidence, preparing to escape through the hidden passage. But as they prepared to leave, Emma grabbed Jake's arm. "Before we go, there's something I have to tell you. Something about why Frank really wants me dead." Jake paused, sensing that whatever Emma was about to reveal would change everything again. In Sarah Beth's note, she mentioned that Frank Coleman wasn't just taking bribes for the land fraud. He's been selling information to foreign mining companies, German and British investors, who want to buy up American mineral rights through shell companies. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. He's committing treason. The evidence I'm carrying doesn't just prove corruption, it proves that Frank Coleman has been selling American territory to foreign interests. If this gets out, it could mean war. As they prepared to enter the hidden passage, Jake realized that Emma wasn't just a witness to land fraud. She was carrying evidence of a conspiracy that threatened national security. And Frank Coleman would do anything to keep that evidence from reaching federal authority. The tunnel system beneath the cabin was more extensive than Jake had remembered. They moved through narrow passages carved from limestone, following underground streams that would mask their scent from tracking dogs. "How much farther?" Emma whispered as they crawled through a particularly tight section. "We're almost to the main cave. From there we can follow a creek that leads toward Fort Collins." They emerged into a larger cavern lit by moonlight filtering through cracks in the rock ceiling. The space was large enough for them to stand and rest, and Jake could hear the sound of running water nearby. "Emma," Jake said, checking his weapons. "Once we leave these caves, we'll be in the open for the final push to Fort Collins. Frank's going to throw everything he has at stopping us." "How long until sunrise?" "Maybe 4 hours. If we can reach Judge Warren's courthouse before Frank catches up to us, we'll be safe." Emma pulled out her sister's documents, studying them in the pale moonlight. "Jake, there's something else in here I haven't told you about." Sarah Beth found evidence that Frank's conspiracy goes even higher than we thought. "How much higher?" "Territorial Governor Morrison is involved. So is the federal land commissioner. This isn't just about a few corrupt officials taking bribes. It's about a systematic plan to transfer American territory to foreign control." Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. They weren't just seeking justice for a murdered woman anymore. They were carrying evidence that could prevent the loss of American sovereignty in the territories. "Emma, if Governor Morrison is involved, then Frank has access to territorial militia. He could have hundreds of men hunting us by morning. Then we'd better make sure we reach Judge Warren before morning." They followed the underground stream until it emerged from the cave system into a narrow canyon. The night air was cold and clear, and Jake could see the lights of Fort Collins twinkling in the distance. 12 miles, he said, helping Emma navigate the rocky stream bed. "We can make it if we push hard." But as they climbed out of the canyon, the sound of barking dogs echoed through the darkness. Frank had brought tracking hounds, and they were closing fast. "This way," Jake said, leading Emma toward a stand of pine trees that would provide cover. "We need to reach higher ground where the dogs can't follow our scent." They climbed steadily through the darkness, using game trails and rocky outcroppings to mask their passage. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew closer, and Jake could see torches moving through the valley below. "How many men does he have now?" Emma asked as they paused to catch their breath. "At least 20, probably more." Jake studied the terrain ahead of them. "But we have an advantage. I know this country better than Frank does." "What's the plan?" "There's an old mining road that leads over the ridge. It's steep and dangerous, but it cuts the distance to Fort Collins in half. Frank's men will have to go around the long way." They pushed higher into the mountains, following the abandoned mining road through terrain that would have been treacherous even in daylight. The path wound along cliff faces, and through narrow passes where a single misstep could mean death. "Emma," Jake said as they navigated a particularly dangerous section, "I need you to know something. If we don't make it to Fort Collins, if Frank catches us before we can deliver your evidence, I want you to promise me something. Promise me you'll destroy those documents rather than let Frank get his hands on them. The lives of everyone in this territory could depend on keeping that evidence away from foreign interests." Emma was quiet for a moment, understanding the full implications of what he was asking. "And if I destroy the evidence, Sarah Beth's murder goes unpunished. Some things are more important than justice for one person, even someone as innocent as your sister." "I understand," Emma said quietly. "But Jake, I'm not planning to let Frank catch up." They reached the top of the ridge as the first hint of dawn appeared on the horizon. Below them, the lights of Fort Collins glowed like a beacon of hope. But between them and safety lay 5 miles of open country with no cover. "There," Jake pointed toward a cluster of buildings at the edge of town. "Judge Warren's courthouse. If we can reach it, we'll be under federal protection." But as they prepared for the final descent, Emma grabbed his arm. Jake. Look. Riders were emerging from the trees below them, spreading out to cut off their approach to town. Frank had anticipated their route and positioned his men perfectly. We're trapped, Emma said. Jake studied the positioning of Frank's men, counting at least 30 riders deployed across the approaches to Fort Collins. But as he watched, he noticed something that gave him hope. Emma, do you see that group of riders coming from the east? Those aren't Frank's men. Emma followed his gaze and saw a column of federal cavalry approaching Fort Collins from the opposite direction. Blue uniforms gleamed in the early morning light, and at their head rode a figure Jake recognized. Judge Warren, Jake said with relief. He's brought federal troops. But Frank had seen the cavalry too, and Jake could see him regrouping his men for a desperate final assault. The corrupt marshal knew that once the federal troops reached Emma and her evidence, his conspiracy would be exposed. Emma, Jake said, checking his weapons one final time. This is Frank's going to make his move now before those federal troops can intervene. Are you ready? Emma clutched her sister's documents against her chest and looked into Jake's eyes with fierce determination. For Sarah Beth, the final confrontation began as Frank Coleman led his men in a desperate charge up the mountainside. Federal cavalry galloped from the east, while Jake and Emma fought their way down the western slope. The evidence that could save the territory clutched in Emma's hand. Justice for a murdered sister, exposure of a treasonous conspiracy, and the future of American sovereignty in the territories all hung in the balance as the sun rose over Fort Collins. The battle was fierce but brief. Federal cavalry led by Judge Warren himself reached Emma and Jake just as Frank's men closed in for the final assault. In the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Emma managed to place Sarah Beth's documents directly into Judge Warren's hand. Frank Coleman fell with a federal bullet in his chest, his conspiracy crumbling around him as honest lawmen finally gained the upper hand. 6 months later, Jake stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching Emma tend the garden she'd planted where they had first planned to bury Sarah Beth. The trials were over, the corrupt officials imprisoned, and the territorial government was finally free from foreign influence. Emma had chosen to stay not as Sarah Beth's replacement, but as herself, the woman who had carried her sister's evidence to safety, who had helped expose a conspiracy that threatened American sovereignty, who had found love in the middle of tragedy and betrayal. Mrs. Morrison, Jake called out, still loving the sound of her new name. Emma straightened from her garden work and smiled at the man who had become her whole world. What had started as deception and desperate circumstances had grown into something real, something lasting. As they walked into their home together, Emma reflected on how far they'd all come. The wrong sister had survived that terrible day, but she had survived for a purpose. Justice had been served, love had been found, and the territory was safe. Sometimes the worst mistakes lead to the best ending.